As you and Shamstrania reported, the league's new collective bargaining agreement will give players the ability to invest in NBA and WNBA teams, as well as promote and or invest in sports betting and cannabis companies, sources tell The Athletic. And then Shams followed it up quickly with how this will work. Sources say players will be able to invest in NBA/WNBA teams via the NBPA's selected private equity firm, an unprecedented opportunity in U.S. sports, and do endorsement deals with sports betting companies with complete separation from the gambling component. So that's a lot to dive into there on its own. It features into the idea of wealth building for players that you discussed very early in our conversation here. When I saw this, I had some questions. I felt like to make this work even remotely, there were going to have to be some very significant guardrails put in place. So I don't know what those guardrails are yet beyond this private equity firm that it feels like the NBA will be employing. But my immediate reaction to this tweet was twofold. Basically, A, we're going to get some bullshit like Kevin Durant signing a 2-year, $8 million contract, then getting like 1% equity in the Phoenix Suns or something like that. Because 1% equity in the Phoenix Suns is worth, probably God knows, like 50 million on its own. Right. And then on top of it, the sports betting side is, I don't really care about this because I think I have a better feel for the sports betting industry. Like I, do work with Tab, and I know like the separation of powers that kind of comes into play there with the content creation side versus the like market building side of sports betting companies. But I felt like this was a thing that was just going to create a lot of uncertainty in the minds of fans regarding like how hard players are playing in games and whether or not they're taking it seriously, whether or not they're throwing games, essentially questions about the integrity of the game in some fans' minds. And while I personally think that that's like bullshit, and I can't see a player tossing away like hundreds of millions of dollars to like gamble on basketball games unless you're gambling like $1 million per game. I also think that, and it's just really hard to find like sports books that will take $1 million like bets per game, especially when you're like in business with them and like everything. But like beyond that, it felt like a real way for enemies of the league, let's call them, people who are conspiratorial by nature, people who want to try and find the worst in the league, to question the integrity of the league in a way that it surprised me that the NBA was willing to go down this road.
Well, I mean, I don't think, unless I haven't seen anything, but I think players still can't bet, right? Like, so that rule is still in place. So, I mean, that would, to me, raise the biggest issue of the integrity of the game, right? But they still can't bet. They can sponsor sports books. If player X wants to start sponsoring, sportsbook X, just like they do, like shoes or whatever, that is now open to them where they hadn't been before. I agree with you. I don't really think it's going to be an issue of actual integrity of the game. Like, who would throw away? You're talking about guys who are in the middle of the league now being able to make over $100 million over the course of their life.
Yeah.
Right. just being a guy who makes the mid-level for like 5-6 years.
Yeah. Like the 150th best player in the NBA is going to be like a 9-figure player now.
Right. So like the amount of money that they can gain from their NBA salary is not going to be anywhere close from the sponsorship deal that they can sign with like DraftKings or FanDuel or whatever. Correct. So I don't think that's gonna be a thing, but I think it does open more, another can of worms for the league in terms of just perception, right? Like we've seen leagues get further into bed with betting companies, right? Like that always opens yourself up to criticism of some sort. Now we see the players are gonna be able to do it too. In some sense, it does have a level of fairness, right? If the NBA and its teams can profit from all of these betting companies, why not the players, right? Like, again, still no one can bet, right? Like players can't bet, coaches can't bet, Team execs can't bet. So that's still in place. They're all just kind of making money from saying, hey, tweet on this, click on this link in my tweet, and you get a free
Yep.
sign up account so you can lose your money at this sports book. That's all going to be there. And I think that's kind of where this whole sports betting, this new opening into being a sponsor for a sports book, or being having a small investment stake in that will come from. And I think the money that they can potentially make from that is not going to be anywhere near the money that they can make from their NBA contracts. And if you're just going to view it in that sense, like the utilitarian sense, I'm going to make a lot more money from basketball than from anything else, and that's what you're going to try to value.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really, really good points. The investment side is just strange to me. And I like what happens when, I'm trying to think like what happens if the Mavs give Luka a, 0.05% stake in the Mavs, and then, he leaves and goes to the Rockets or some shit like that. Right?
I don't think that's going to happen either. I think it's going to be done again, like the hard part is I don't think all the details are completely ironed out yet from what I understand, but I think the way that investments are going to work is that there's going to be basically a fund which players can themselves put money into, and that so they're not investing in an individual team, right? So you can't just then like you said, if you're Luka, you hit free agency, be like, well, I know I have an investment in the Magic, right? Let me go sign with the Magic to increase the value of that equity. I think it's going to be a lot more almost like a trust in some degree, more so than it is, in that individual ownership. And I was talking to Michelle Roberts about it a few years ago when she was leaving the office as executive director. And that was her big regret for not being able to get that done during her term. And one of the ideas she proposed was almost like an NBA equity stake in teams, so that when they do sell out, like in the case of the Suns, when Robert Sarver sells out, players own, I don't know, 1-2%, they get to cash out a little bit in the course of that sale too. And so again, we'll see what the final details look like, but I think it's more that kind of institutional way than it is a player having a direct investment stake in a team.
And Bryce Simon asks this question. I mean, will players be able to become investors or own actual equity in sports betting sites?
Yeah, I believe that they can. I don't know to what percentage, but I believe that they'll have an ability to invest in a sports betting company.
Interesting. Okay, that's very interesting information. I mean, this is why I ask you. This is why you're on the show, to answer all of these random questions I have. Okay, and by the way, like there are some answers, not like complete answers yet, which is always fun. Okay, let's talk about a few more things that will impact the players more on the team building side, right? So, they've agreed to increase the upper limits on extensions from a 120% increase on final year salary to a 140% increase on final year salary. So, for instance, under the current rules, Jaylen Brown would be eligible to sign a 4-year, $165 million contract. But with the extension rules increased to 140%, Brown would be able to reach a 4-year, $189 million agreement then, which is according to Bobby Marks. Shout out Bobby for calculating that, obviously. But these are big changes, and they will allow teams that have incumbent stars to be able to retain them a little bit more easily without them hitting the market. I think that's like an incredibly important aspect of this negotiation.
Yeah, I think a big part of the CBA was driven towards helping teams be able to retain their players, right? Through that. So maybe the Hawks have a better chance of retaining DeJounte Murray when his contract is up. Maybe the Kings have a better chance of not having Sabonis hit free agency when his contract is up, right? Like it gives you a better chance to almost reward a team for being able to lock in a player and develop them into an all-star level player, even if you didn't expect it, right? And there's other changes too. I think that there's a larger mid-level exception now, of course, for those teams that are not over that second apron. The rookie extensions, you can now do a 5-year extension with rookies. Before this, it was just 4 years unless you were the designated max guy, right? So I think they've opened up avenues to be able to help teams keep their players by giving them larger, longer extensions than they could under the current CBA that we're under.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought up the idea of the quote unquote like rookie super max contract players, right? Like the NBA and NBPA agreed to eliminate restrictions that limited a team to two designated super max contract players on a roster. So essentially the Cavs, who already have Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland under roster, would have had to trade one of those two in order to sign Evan Mobley to a supermax contract,
Mhm.
which is fucking crazy. Like the Cavs should absolutely not have been like penalized for getting an incredible Donovan Mitchell trade and then drafting Darius Garland and Evan Mobley.
Yeah.
That's fucking crazy to me. Like, I'm glad that we finally have some sense brought into this, right? Another team that this could impact long term is Oklahoma City, particularly. This entire CBA benefits Oklahoma City for reasons we'll get to momentarily, but I think that it's really, really important the fact that Oklahoma City now, and it's all going to be incumbent upon ownership to make a decision to do this. But right now, they have four guys on their roster alone before accounting for the like future 15 first round picks that they have. They have four guys on their roster alone that right now I think project as like max or borderline-ish max players in Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, Josh Giddey, and Chet Holmgren. So like the fact that they're going to be able to theoretically sign all of those guys to 25% maxes is what should happen. Like this
Right.
is how this should be. If you draft as well as Oklahoma City has, you should get to retain those players long term if you want to retain them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is like when Oklahoma City gives out 4 max contracts and now they're above that second apron, they'll still have the ability to re-sign, whatever draft pick they make and keep him too, right? So like for all the punitive measures of the second apron, it still allows them to re-sign their own players. It doesn't allow you to hit the buyout market, which I don't really think is that big of a loss for most teams. There's very few players that are actually good that come out of that, and there's some restrictions on how far out you can trade a pick. But I think that's the big thing from this is that like if you're a team that's good at drafting and developing, it should probably help you keep the guys that you get into your organization. It was wild to me that they had a restriction on the designated rookie extensions to begin with. Like I don't know who thought that through in the original CBA or the past CBA, but that was not a good idea.
Yeah, it's a really bad idea. I think the idea was that like these guys would try and force themselves to like big markets, and thus we wanted to try and stop them from being able to like team up together on like max rookie extensions or designated extensions. It was silly at the time. The final thing here for the players before we get into like the ownership stuff is we're gonna get 3 two-way contracts, not just two-way contracts. I think that is a very, very important piece of this. And then additionally, there is now a second round exception where you can sign a player to a rostered agreement instead of having to dip into the mid-level exception to be able to do that. So, for instance, the Lakers this summer had to dip into their mid-level to sign Max Christie, and thus couldn't give someone like a full mid-level exception to be able to do so without forcing Max Christie to sit in the G League for a year and like not be on their roster and thus infuriate his representation and everything that comes with that. I think that is an incredibly smart adjustment by the league. And I think the third two-way contract, I've gone both ways on it. I feel like a little bit concerned that teams are going to use the third two-way as a reason to just roster 14 players like for the entire year. And not every team will do that, certainly, but it will be a very well spread tax avoidance measure in a way that concerns me a little bit.
Yeah, and that's double-edged sword of this. There's the concern or the potential for teams to just sign 3 two-way guys and just have 14 guys on the roster. There's also some train of thought that like, hey, now you have an extra two-way spot, so you can bring in a rookie or bring in a second-year guy, give him a two-way contract, and be able to retain one of those 15 spots to still sign a veteran, right? So maybe this will keep more veterans on rosters, increase job opportunities for them. Not to mention the mid-level exception increases how much money they can get through the mid-level exception, right? Because that was always something teams were kind of saving up through free agency to eventually sign their own rookies. I think it'll also create potentially 30 more G League spots, right? Like 30 more on G League rosters. So again, this should help just a little more lift up the floor a little bit more for those young guys coming into the league and getting more opportunities potentially.
So the final thing here is there will be a 7.5% increase in terms of the mid-level exception and a 30% increase in terms of the room exception. So a 7.5% increase in the mid-level exception for this upcoming season will essentially be the mid-level exception going up by like $1 million or so, something in that ballpark. And then the room exception, that's like 2.5. So that'll jump to like 3.3, 3.4, maybe 3.5, somewhere in that ballpark. So you're going to be able to get a little bit more bang for your buck from those things, if we're putting real numbers on it. So like Austin Reeves, if he gets a full mid-level exception contract from the Lakers this summer, it's going to go from like 450, 451 to essentially like 455, 56, 57, somewhere in that range off the top of my head. I don't feel like doing hyper quick math beyond that. So the numbers will increase just a little bit in terms of that.